Hi, I'm Beth with American Patchwork and Quilting, and we're on our last block in the Bright New Day block of the month. Today, I'll show how to assemble block 12, and then I'm going to give some tips for fixing those previous blocks that maybe didn't turn out quite the right size. As always, you'll find the link to the free pattern in the video description. So we saved a nice, easy one for last. It's just squares and triangle squares. If you need a little bit of a refresher on triangle squares, check out the block 5 video that has all of our tips for triangle squares. So lay out your block with your squares and your triangle squares, and then we're going to assemble the center pinwheel first, and then the side triangle square and square units, and then put that together in rows. We're pressing seams open throughout the block because there are multiple seams coming together in several spots. Here are the 2 completed blocks. Today I was sewing with the Heart Song collection by Gabrielle Neal for Riley Blake Designs. Such a fun color palette on this one, and I just love this sky background with the pinwheel design and the little propellers. I think it fits perfectly. And the second one is using My Country by Kathy Schmidt Studios for Moda Fabrics. So this fat quarter bundle came with a panel, and a fun way to use a panel is to cut it up and use it as accents in your blocks. So I chose this small star for the corners, and it adds such a nice touch. When you have all 12 of your blocks completed, it's a good idea to go through and check them and make sure that they are the right size. So they should all be 12.5 inches square. But what if they're not? Well, I have some tips for fixing those. It can be tempting to find your smallest block and then just trim all the blocks down to that size, but keep in mind this will likely change the look of the quilt quite a bit. Most of the blocks in this block of the month have points near the edges, so even if you trim off 1/8 of an inch, then as soon as you are sewing this to your sashing, you're going to lose those points in your seam allowance. So it's just going to look a lot different. And then once you have made the block smaller, then the sashing and the borders need to be smaller too. And since there are multiple borders on this quilt, those small changes can really magnify as you're putting your top together. I usually find that my blocks turned out a little too small, so if this is the case for you, you can add borders or coping strips to your blocks to bring them to a uniform size. So this is basically, you're just gonna sew some extra fabric all the way around and then square up your block. So I'd recommend using the background fabric of your block. That way it's going to blend in as much as possible. I ran out of my background fabric, so this is my replacement fabric that I used for the rest of the quilt top. So you could also use a contrasting fabric if you want to make it a little bit more of a design element. But keep in mind, if you're adding varying widths, like some blocks are quite a bit smaller than the other, you might be able to tell that a little more. You'll see that that is wider on some than others. So keep that in mind when you're picking your fabric. My block ended up to be about 12 1/8 inch square. So I don't need to add too much fabric. So I had these 1-inch strips left over from cutting some of my other pieces, so these will work in my case. I'd err on the side of cutting your strips a little wider though, just to make sure that you get enough added, and then you can trim that down once those are sewn on. I like to sew these with my block facing up so I can watch my points and make sure I'm not cutting those off when I'm adding my coping strip. So you can see this is what it looks like once you've added those coping strips. I just left these long because I'm going to be trimming them anyway, so no need to get too picky on that. And I love using a square ruler. This one happens to be 12.5 inch square, which is perfect because that is the exact size I need. That's really going to make it easy for me to line up the center with the center of my block so that I make sure that I am centering this on my coping strips, and then I can just trim all the way around. Here's my block once it's been trimmed. So you can see once you add that sashing, that's going to blend right in. If you're off by just a small margin, maybe like a 1/16 or 1/8 of an inch, you can let your sewing machine ease that difference in. You'll want to disengage your integrated dual feed or a walking foot, if you have that on, you don't want to use that for this technique. And then you want to put the longer piece on the bed of the machine and the shorter piece on top. The feed dogs will help pull that bottom piece through just a little bit faster and help ease in that difference. Now this will only work if the blocks are just a little off though. You can't ease in a 1-inch discrepancy. So you can see it's still just a tiny bit off, but it's close enough that I think it'll work fine. In extreme cases, you may just need to remake the blocks, or you can try ripping out the seams and restitching them. Just be sure to check your 1/4-inch seam for accuracy. So if your blocks are always turning out too small, your seam allowance is likely too large. And if they're turning out too big, your seam allowance is likely too small. So stitch up block 12 and then get the rest ready for finishing. We'd love to see all 12 of your blocks. Share them with us in our Facebook group or on Instagram with the hashtag APQBOM2021. Happy sewing!